Hi everyone, Professor Carson here. If you've already read the readings for interpersonal communication, you should have a pretty good understanding of what interpersonal communication is and some basic ways to apply it to business. In this lecture, we're going to talk about a few more advanced topics, and then again, we're going to talk about how to apply those concepts and skills from interpersonal communication into business communication. So like I said, our objectives for today, we're going to understand some more advanced topics from interpersonal communications, we're going to learn some key theories from the field, and then we're going to learn to apply interpersonal communication concepts to business. So a lot of the content for this lecture is going to come from this textbook called Interpersonal Communication, A Mindful Approach to Relationships. It's one I've used before to teach an interpersonal communication class. It's very well organized, very well written, and it's also free. So I have a link to that in the description if you want to take a look at it. And if interpersonal communication is a topic that you want to learn more about, definitely check this textbook out. Take a look at some of the chapters and read around if you want. It's definitely an interesting field of communication, and this book does a really good job of exploring it for someone who's new to that field. Now let's talk about defining interpersonal communication. And something important to think about is thinking about interpersonal communication in the context of other types of communication. When you're looking at how humans communicate, you can organize communication into 5 categories, as shown with this pyramid on the screen. At the top, you have intrapersonal communication, which is communication with yourself. This might include thinking, reflecting, self-talk. And then we have interpersonal communication, the topic of our lecture today. This is communication between 2 people or a few people, and this topic will go over building relationships, exchanging information, trying to solve problems. Next, we have group communication, and this is communication organized among groups of 3 or more people, and this topic will explore how the group communicates internally with people inside the group, and how the group communicates with outsiders or even other groups that are outside of the group. Next, we have public communication, which is when one person communicates to a larger audience. This might be a speech, a presentation, a lecture. And then lastly, we have mediated communication. This is communication that occurs through technology or a medium such as email, text messages, social media, video calls, television even. And like I said, these are many different ways that humans communicate, but we're talking specifically about interpersonal communication, how 2 people or just a few people will communicate with each other. Now let's talk about what we use interpersonal communications for. And one perspective is that we use it to meet our personal needs. You might recognize this image as being Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in which he categorized people's needs on a scale from the most basic needs, such as our physiological needs. Going up from there, we have our safety needs, our need for love and belonging, our need for esteem. At the very top, we have our need for self-actualization. And interpersonal communication can meet needs in all of these 5 areas. At our physiological needs, our need for food, for example, if you think of a more historical example, people in hunter-gatherer cultures were way more successful at getting food and having a safe supply of food than somebody simply living by themselves and hunting alone. Even if you flash forward to today, whether you go to the grocery store or even get groceries delivered, you still need to do communication in order to get food for most people nowadays. Go all the way up to self-actualization and things like people having a creative outlet or people having morality relies on them to communicate with other people. And it's maybe not impossible, but a lot harder to do that if you're completely by yourself and you're completely isolated from other people and not having any interpersonal communication. So interpersonal communication enables us to meet a lot of these needs that Maslow talked about in his hierarchy of needs. Now let's talk about 2 other ideas for what we use interpersonal communications for. One idea is that we use it to learn about ourselves and others. And a lot of that learning happens by exchanging information about people, discussing opinions about people, and even sometimes comparing ourselves to other people. Interpersonal communication is also how we build and maintain relationships. Trust is an important part of a strong relationship, and it doesn't just happen naturally. As we repeatedly interact with people, we're able to develop expectations of how other people will behave and act, and that predictability is what allows us to trust someone, at least according to one theory that we'll talk about in a little bit. Lastly, let's talk about why we study interpersonal communications. One of the main reasons we study it is because it helps us better understand what is happening when people interact. It gives us tools to analyze how we communicate, why we communicate the way we do, and how our messages affect other people. It also helps us understand our relationships. The way we communicate with people can shape the quality of those relationships over time. Another important part is identifying the effects of our communication, what communication methods are more effective, and which methods create problems instead. For example, a manager might notice that one approach to giving feedback motivates employees, while another creates confusion or frustration. And ultimately, studying communication helps us find solutions. Instead of just saying that someone might have a problem communicating, we can identify what is going wrong and use our understanding of communication to improve the situation. Now, let's look at two theories that describe how we build interpersonal relationships. First, social penetration theory, developed in 1973 by psychologists Irwin Altman and Almus Taylor, uses the idea that people are like onions. As relationships develop, we slowly peel back layers and reveal more personal information about ourselves. At the beginning of a relationship, we usually share more surface level information like basic facts or general opinions. As we build trust, we may reveal deeper parts of ourselves like our values, fears, goals, or personal experiences. The theory suggests that this process is somewhat predictable. Relationships often move from less intimate communication toward more intimate communication, but intimacy depends on what we choose to disclose and how we interpret the other person's response. If someone responds positively and makes us feel accepted, we're more likely to continue opening up. Under this theory, self-disclosure is considered the driving force of relationship development. In business, this applies to building relationships with coworkers, managers, and customers. A manager who shares appropriate personal experiences may build trust with employees, and a salesperson who takes time to understand a customer's needs can develop a stronger relationship. However, good communicators also understand that disclosure needs to happen at the right time and in the right context. Unfortunately, there are a few criticisms of this theory. One is that this theory assumes a linear progression for relationships that always progresses from outer layers to the more intimate inner layers. But relationships are usually more complicated. Sometimes relationships can skip layers or jump backwards based on events that occur within the relationship. So perhaps there's another theory that can describe how we build relationships. Another theory that looks at how relationships develop is uncertainty reduction theory, developed in 1975 by Charles Berger and Richard Calabresi. The main idea behind this theory is that when we first meet someone, we often experience uncertainty. We don't know much about that person, how they think, how they'll behave, and that uncertainty can create stress. The theory breaks uncertainty into two types: cognitive uncertainty, based on what someone else's thoughts and beliefs are, and behavioral uncertainty, based on what someone else might do. Because uncertainty can be uncomfortable, people use communication to reduce it and make interactions more predictable. The theory describes three main strategies people use. Passive strategies involve observing someone without directly interacting with them, like watching how a coworker behaves in a meeting. Active strategies involve seeking information through other sources, like asking someone else about that person. Interactive strategies involve directly communicating with the person and asking them questions. And a recent addition to these strategies is extractive information seeking, where people gather information from available sources, such as looking at someone's LinkedIn profile or Facebook page to learn more about them. The hope is that by implementing these strategies to reduce uncertainty and increase predictability, one can feel less stress and more trust with a person. However, there are some criticisms of this theory. One criticism is that it assumes people always want to reduce uncertainty, but that's not always true. Sometimes uncertainty can be exciting or useful, especially when getting to know someone new. Another criticism is that relationships do not always become more predictable over time. People can still surprise us even after years of interaction. The theory is useful for understanding first impressions, but it may not explain everything that happens in a relationship. Now let's move away from relationship development and talk about one last theory that goes over behaviors in interpersonal communication. Expectancy violations theory was developed by Judy K. Burgoon beginning in 1976. This theory originally came from research on proxemics, which is the study of personal space and how people use physical distance when communicating. The main idea is that we all have expectations about how other people should behave. Some expectations are predictive, meaning they're based on what we normally expect to happen because of culture, social norms, or past experiences. Other expectations are prescriptive, meaning they're based on what we think should happen or what we would consider appropriate behavior. When someone violates these expectations, it gets our attention. A behavior violation can be distracting because we notice that something is different from what we expected. But whether we view that violation positively or negatively depends on the situation and the person involved. For example, if a manager gives you extra encouragement and support, that might be a positive violation because it exceeds your expectation. But if a coworker interrupts you constantly, that could be viewed negatively. Our response also depends on how we categorize that person. Someone we respect may get the benefit of the doubt, while someone we already dislike may be judged more harshly. In business, this theory helps explain why small behaviors matter. People have expectations about all sorts of things like communication style, tone, body language, personal space. Effective communicators understand these expectations and know when breaking them can strengthen a relationship versus when it can damage one. Now, to wrap things up, let's talk about some important skills for successfully using interpersonal communication. The first is listening skills, and the main idea of this is to give careful and thoughtful attention to messages that you receive. Some common pitfalls to avoid and how to avoid them are haste. Instead of being hasty, be patient when listening. Instead of being invisible, show your presence through eye contact and head nods. Instead of being defensive, be open-minded and be willing to accept responsibility. Instead of being exhausted, try to reschedule a time to meet with that person when you have more energy, because fatigue will impact your ability to listen. And instead of having inaction in response to a conversation, maybe you can try to summarize main points and next steps or follow up on the conversation. Now, when we talk about people skills, that can be a pretty broad concept, but here are 3 different ways that we can try to define it. The first is to understand people, and this might be understanding who they are, but it also might be understanding what they're trying to communicate. Another is to be able to feel empathy or sympathy for another person and their emotions. And another would be to understand other people's perspectives and be able to see situations from those other people's perspectives. Now, if you've heard of IQ before, this is kind of the counterpart to IQ, which is emotional intelligence. And there's 4 key skills with emotional intelligence. The first one is perceiving, the ability to identify and recognize one's own emotions and the emotions of others around them. The next one is understanding, the ability to understand complex emotions and how they link to other emotions that someone may be experiencing. Next is using, so the ability to generate specific emotions and use these emotions within interpersonal interactions with others. And lastly, managing, the ability to control your emotions in yourself and in other people. The next skill to consider is appropriate skill selection. And the idea behind this is if you have a toolbox, you want to use the right tool for the job. You might be capable of being strong and assertive, and you might also be capable of being gentle and passive. Is it always good to be strong? Is it always good to be gentle? The idea behind this is that based on the situation, it might be better to be strong or it might be better to be gentle. And the ability to decide which is the best skill to use in that situation is important for being a successful communicator. And lastly, the ability to communicate ethically is also important. The ability to both make sure that your own communication is ethical and to identify when other people are being ethical or unethical with the way that they're communicating. I have this as an example. These are 9 statements that are created by the National Communication Association that kind of exemplify how communicators talk about ethics and what a lot of people in communication consider to be ethical behavior when it comes to communicating. We advocate truthfulness, accuracy, honesty, and reason as essential to the integrity of the communication. We endorse freedom of expression, diversity of perspective, and tolerance of dissent to achieve the informed and responsible decision-making fundamental to a civil society. We strive to understand and respect other communicators before evaluating and responding to their messages. We promote access to communication resources and opportunities as necessary to fulfill human potential and contribute to the well-being of individuals, families, communities, and society. We promote communication climates of caring and mutual understanding that respect the unique needs and characteristics of individual communicators. We condemn communication that degrades individuals and humanity through distortion, intimidation, coercion, and violence, and through the expression of intolerance and hatred. We are committed to the courageous expression of personal convictions in pursuit of fairness and justice. We advocate sharing information, opinions, and feelings when facing significant choices, while also respecting privacy and confidentiality. And we accept responsibility for the short and long-term consequences for our own communication and expect the same of others.